The first thing I noticed wasn't his voice, it was the cologne, that sharp cedar and bergamot smell my brother had worn since he was 22 years old, the one our father used to joke made him smell like a cologne counter at Macy's. I would have recognized it anywhere, even there, in the neuro ICU at Mercy General, with my head packed in gauze and machines beeping every few seconds on my left side. The smell hit me before anything else did. I wasn't supposed to be conscious. The neurologist had explained it to my husband before the embolization, a procedure to repair the brain aneurysm they'd found after I collapsed in the parking lot of my office building on a Tuesday morning in March. The recovery, she said, would involve induced sedation for at least 48 hours to reduce intracranial pressure. I would be unaware. I would feel nothing. I would remember nothing. She was half right. I felt nothing. But I heard everything. It started as fragments. Voices filtering through what felt like deep water. My husband's voice first, low, careful, the tone he used when he was performing calm rather than feeling it, then my brother's, and then a third voice, female, one I placed after a moment, Serena, my brother's girlfriend of 2 years, the one who had, at our last family Christmas, spent 40 minutes explaining to our father why she deserved a seat on the board of his company. Our father had died 8 months earlier. I should explain that. My father, Raymond Aldridge, built Aldridge & Sons, a regional logistics company out of Columbus, Ohio, from a single freight truck and 22 years of 6-day work weeks. He had 3 children, my brother Philip, me and our younger sister Gwen, who lived in Portland and wanted nothing to do with the business. When he died of a heart attack at 71, his will divided the company equally between Philip and me, with a buyout clause if either of us wanted to sell our share. Gwen received the house in Hilliard in a cash inheritance. It was, everyone agreed, a fair arrangement. Everyone except Philip, apparently. I didn't know that yet, lying in that ICU bed. I was still assembling the sounds around me into something coherent, the way you piece together a dream right after waking. Slippery, uncertain, possible. The power of attorney is already on file, my husband said. We had it drawn up last year. So we can move on the accounts? Philip asked. A pause. A short one. We can move on everything. The machines kept beeping. I kept breathing. I focused on keeping my face still, my hands loose at my sides, my eyelids exactly as heavy as they'd been a moment before. Some deep animal part of my brain understood before my conscious mind did. Do not let them know you can hear this. Do not move. Do not react. Serena spoke then. What about the accountant? She's been asking questions. I'll handle Linda, Philip said. She's been with the company for 15 years. She's loyal to the business, not to anyone specific. I thought, you have never understood people at all, Philip. I thought, Linda has worked for Dad for 15 years and she will know exactly what she's looking at the moment you show her the paperwork. I thought, keep your face still. My husband. I'll call him what he was, even though I still have difficulty with the word. My husband, Owen, said something I didn't catch because a nurse had come in briefly, adjusting something near my IV line, speaking softly to someone in the hallway. When she left and the door whispered shut again, Serena was in the middle of a sentence. Not like she's going to wake up and just immediately be back to normal. The doctor said weeks of recovery. By the time she's clear-headed enough to understand what's happened. She's sharp, Owen said, and I heard something in his voice I couldn't name. Not guilt, exactly. Something older and more tired than guilt. We have to have everything finalized before she starts asking questions. The filing is Monday, Philip said. It'll be done. What filing? What was Monday? I lay there and breathed and tried to build the shape of it from the pieces I had. The power of attorney. Real. Legitimately drawn up the previous year when I'd had a minor health scare, and Owen had insisted on having documents in place. At the time I thought it was love. Practicality. I'd signed without reading every page, which is the single decision I would spend the next 14 months regretting. The accounts. Aldridge & Sons operated 3 primary accounts: operating, payroll, and a capital reserve our father had built up over 20 years. Together, they held just over $4 million. I was the co-signatory on all 3. Under a valid power of attorney, Owen could act as my proxy. The filing. That one took me longer, but I had time. I had nothing but time, and the steady beep of machines and the smell of my brother's cologne. They left within the hour. I heard the squeak of Owen's shoes on the linoleum. He always walked slightly pigeon-toed, a sound I'd have known in any building, and then the heavy push of the ICU door, and then silence, except for one person. A presence I'd been vaguely aware of for most of the conversation, moving quietly near the window, adjusting blinds or a chair or something that required no real attention but kept her in the room. A nurse. She had come in partway through and, unlike the first one, had not left. I heard her step closer, then her hand, light and careful, rested on mine. She didn't speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You're awake, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. Old instinct, give nothing away until you know who you're giving it to. "My name is Adrian," she said. "I'm going to change your IV bag, and while I do that, I'm going to tell you that I came in about 12 minutes into that conversation. I want you to know that, so you know what I heard." Another pause. The soft sound of equipment being handled. "If you want help, squeeze my hand once before I leave." I have thought about that moment many times since, about what it requires of a person, a stranger, a woman on a 12-hour shift in a neuro ICU, to make that offer, to choose to be someone's witness, to decide that what she overheard in that room was not her business to walk away from. Before she left, I squeezed her hand once. Her name was Adrienne Moss. She had been an ICU nurse for 11 years. She was, I later learned, the kind of person who kept a running list in her phone of every patient she'd sat with at the end of their life, because she believed someone should remember their names. She was the most important stranger I have ever met. What she did over the following 36 hours was this: she documented. She noted the time she entered the room. She made a written record of what she heard, not an official hospital report, which would have required processes she didn't have time for, but a personal account, time-stamped, detailed, stored in 2 places. She also, quietly, asked a colleague to make sure my room had a second nurse present during any family visits. I didn't know any of this while it was happening. I was still sedated. I was still, to everyone observing, unconscious. But I was building a list. I grew up watching my father run a business with his hands as much as his mind. He used to say that the most dangerous moment in any negotiation was when the other side thought they'd already won. They stopped watching. They stopped being careful. They started making mistakes. Philip had stopped being careful approximately the moment he decided I was going to be in a coma long enough for it not to matter. He'd also made a fundamental error about Linda. Linda Beauchamp had been my father's head accountant since I was in middle school. She had perfect recall of every financial document that had crossed her desk in 15 years. She also had, as I well knew, an almost physical aversion to anything that didn't add up, a quality that had once led her to catch a $340,000 billing discrepancy from a vendor my father had worked with for a decade. When Philip walked into her office 4 days after my hospitalization and presented her with transfer authorization paperwork, signed by Owen, acting under power of attorney, she did what she always did. She asked questions. "The signatures are valid," Philip told her. "The signatures are valid," Linda agreed. "The source documentation for the transfer isn't." She pointed at a line on the filing. "This references a board resolution from February. We don't have a board resolution from February. We've never had a board resolution from February because Vivienne hasn't signed off on one since your father passed. My name, Vivienne Aldridge Cole, 38 years old, co-owner of a regional logistics company, and at this particular moment, lying in a hospital bed with a titanium coil in an artery in my brain, aware that my husband and my brother were attempting to transfer the company's capital reserve into a new LLC that I had never heard of. using documents that reference meetings that had never happened. Linda didn't call Philip back. She called the company's outside counsel, a man named Douglas Hartwell, who had drafted our father's original incorporation documents and who had, over the course of 30 years, developed a very specific expression for situations involving family and money. I am told he wore that expression throughout the entire phone call. He called the Franklin County DA's office the following morning. I woke, not the sustained half-consciousness of those first days, but fully, with the lights too bright and my mouth unbelievably dry, on the Thursday. The neurologist explained what had happened to my brain in careful, measured terms. Owen was there. He held my hand and his face did the thing it had been doing, apparently for years, performing love while calculating something else entirely underneath it. He didn't know I knew. That was the only advantage I had, and I kept it. The next 12 days in that hospital room were the loneliest of my life. My sister Gwen flew in from Portland. She sat with me for hours, and I told her I was tired, which was true, and that I needed to make some calls once I was stronger, which she accepted without question, because Gwen has always understood that I process things inwardly. My mother, who had been in poor health since my father died, called twice a day and I listened to her voice and tried to sound like everything was fine. Adrienne came on shift every other day. She never spoke about any of it directly. It would have been a violation of a dozen protocols, but she always paused at my door before leaving, and once she was off shift, she had started corresponding with Douglas Hartwell's paralegal through a secure email she'd set up specifically for that purpose. I asked to see my medical records on day 6. Owen looked briefly startled before recovering. Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need. I also need my phone, I said. He handed it to me without hesitation, which meant one of two things: he didn't know what was on it, or he'd already checked and found nothing useful. Either way, I used it to call Douglas Hartwell's direct line as soon as Owen stepped out to get coffee. The call lasted 4 minutes. Douglas spoke mostly in careful, non-specific language, the kind that sounds like nothing if overheard, but by the end of it I understood the shape of what they had been building in my absence. Philip and Owen had attempted to do 4 things in the 11 days since my hospitalization. First, transfer $2.3 million from the Aldridge & Sons Capital Reserve into an LLC called Pinnacle Freight Solutions, which had been registered in Delaware 6 weeks before my aneurysm. Second, add Serena as a signatory on the company's primary operating account. Third, file an amended version of my father's partnership agreement that reclassified certain assets as solely Philip's, based on a document that bore what appeared to be my signature from a meeting in January. Fourth, and this one landed somewhere that took me a long time to fully absorb, Owen had spoken to a real estate attorney about liquidating the equity in our house. Our house. The one I'd put down the down payment on using an inheritance from my grandmother. The transfer had been blocked by Linda. The amended agreement was under review by the DA. The house move had stalled because Owen had, apparently, misjudged how quickly a lien could be placed on a property mid-investigation. But the forged signature was real. The document existed, and someone had spent considerable amount of time making it look very much like my handwriting. I lay in that hospital bed and felt something clarify inside me, the way a snow globe settles. All the turbulence of the past 11 days just gradually stilling into something clear and cold. Owen and I had met at a conference in Chicago 14 years before. He was in commercial real estate development. I was managing operations for my father's company, 34 months out of a supply chain management graduate program, still proving to myself that I'd earned my role and hadn't just inherited it. He was charming in the unhurried way of men who have always been the most comfortable person in any room. We married 18 months later in a small ceremony in Columbus, in the backyard of the house where I grew up, and my father had shaken Owen's hand and said quietly, "You're marrying someone remarkable. Act accordingly." He did for about 5 years. The cracks appeared gradually. He resented how much I worked. He resented, I think, that the work mattered to me in a way that wasn't about him. He had built his own company in those years, a small development firm, but it had struggled and contracted and eventually been absorbed into a partnership arrangement that left him technically employed, but not, as he'd imagined, in charge. By the time my father got sick, Owen had developed an interest in Aldridge & Sons that I had chosen not to examine too carefully. I examined it now. I was discharged on a Tuesday, 22 days after the initial collapse. Owen picked me up and drove me home and made dinner. Pasta, simple, careful. And we sat at the kitchen table we'd bought together at an estate sale in Bexley 7 years ago, and I ate and talked about my recovery plan and watched his face for what was actually there. Calculation. Patience. The particular stillness of someone waiting for the right moment. I had already spoken to a divorce attorney. I had already, through Douglas, filed a protective order on all Aldridge & Sons accounts requiring due authorization, mine and an independent third party, for any transaction over $10,000. I had already given my statement to the DA's office investigator over the phone from my hospital room, Adrian's documentation submitted alongside it. What I hadn't done was let Owen know any of this was coming. My sister thought I should have confronted him immediately. Just throw him out, she said over the phone from Portland, where she could afford clean opinions about messy situations. I understood why she felt that way. I also knew that the moment Owen realized the investigation existed, he would lawyer up and the paper trail would get complicated fast. Douglas had been explicit, let the process run. Every day Owen believed he was still in control was a day he might say something, file something, do something that became evidence. He lasted 3 more weeks. The DA's office moved first, on a Wednesday morning in May, with a knock on Philip's door at 7:15 a.m. I know this because Philip called me 20 minutes later, the first time we'd spoken in weeks, and his voice had that particular flatness of someone who has just had the floor drop out from under them. "Vivienne," he said. "Philip," I said. A long silence. "I didn't think it would go this far," he finally said, which was not an apology and was not meant to be. It was an explanation, as if there was some acceptable version of what he'd done, and this outcome was simply an unfortunate overshoot. I thought about saying something. I thought about the Christmas dinners and the arguments about Dad's retirement and the way Philip had stood at our father's graveside and cried in a way that looked, in retrospect, like relief as much as grief. I thought about the forged signature and the Delaware LLC and the 16-year-old house in Hilliard where our mother still lived and who would have told her that her son had been trying to steal from her daughter. "You should call your attorney," I said, and hung up. Owen was served that afternoon. He left the house that evening with 2 suitcases, and I watched him go from the kitchen window, and the main thing I felt was tired. What followed was not, as these things are sometimes described, a triumphant courtroom moment. It was 11 months of depositions and financial forensics, and one morning when I sat across a conference table from a document examiner who spent 90 minutes explaining, in precise technical language, exactly how my signature had been forged. There was a civil case and a criminal case running parallel, the way freight trains sometimes run side by side, same direction, different tracks. The criminal case was Philip's. The civil recovery was mine. Owen cooperated with the DA in exchange for reduced charges. He testified about the LLC formation, about the real estate plan, about the conversations in which Philip had outlined the timeline. In exchange, Owen pled to 1 count of fraud, a felony, and received 3 years probation and was ordered to pay restitution. I was not satisfied with that outcome. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story where I'm supposed to say I found peace, that I let it go, that I focused on healing. All of that came eventually. But in the moment, sitting in that courthouse hallway after Owen's sentencing, I felt the particular frustration of someone whose actual suffering has been translated into a number on a page and a supervised release schedule. Philip's case went to trial. He was convicted on 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of forgery, and 1 count of attempted theft, the Capital Reserve transfer that Linda had stopped before it completed. He was sentenced to 4 years in a federal correctional institution and ordered to pay $890,000 in restitution to Aldridge and Sons. Serena was charged separately. She had been present for multiple planning conversations, had signed documents she knew to be fraudulent, and had been slated to become a signatory on accounts she had no legitimate claim to. She pled guilty to 1 count of conspiracy and received 18 months of probation and a civil judgment of $175,000. It was not, as KSG 7VC might say, complete justice, but it was not nothing. Linda Beauchamp got a very significant raise and a card from me that I wrote 4 times before I got the words right. Adrienne Moss. When I eventually met her in person, outside the hospital, in a coffee shop on High Street, on a rainy November afternoon, turned out to be exactly what her voice had promised. Steady, matter-of-fact, quietly extraordinary. We split a piece of carrot cake, and she told me about a patient she'd been thinking about lately, an older man who had no family and who had passed the previous week, and I listened and felt in a way I hadn't for most of the previous year, like I was sitting with someone who understood that ordinary people contain enormous reserves of both cruelty and decency, and that neither is inevitable. I returned to Aldridge and Sons 8 months after my surgery. The company had been managed in my absence by Douglas's firm and a COO my father had hired 2 years before he died, a steady, unflappable woman named Wren, who had quietly held things together through the entire ordeal and who, when I came back, simply handed me a cup of coffee and a stack of P&L reports and said, "Pick up wherever feels right." The capital reserve, the money Philip had tried to move, was intact. The operating accounts were clean. We lost 2 clients during the uncertainty, and we brought in 4 new ones by the end of the year. My father used to say that a business is only as solid as the people who believe in it enough to stay. He meant it about employees, but I think about it now in a broader sense. Linda stayed. Wren stayed. Adrienne, who had every reason to look the other way, chose to stay in that room. I divorced Owen. It was finalized on a December morning with less ceremony than I had imagined. 2 signatures, a notary, and then I was standing outside on a cold sidewalk in downtown Columbus with a folder under my arm, and my whole life ahead of me, rearranged. My mother still lives in the house in Hilliard. She doesn't talk about Philip directly. She is a woman of her generation in that way. She holds difficult things quietly and privately, and I respect it even when it's hard. She came to my first real birthday dinner post-recovery. Gwen flew in, we cooked too much food, we sat at my mother's kitchen table until after midnight, and at some point she reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "Your father would have wanted me to tell you he knew." I asked what he knew. She smiled, the particular smile of someone choosing how much to share. "That you were the one," she said. "I am still figuring out what to do with that. Some things take time. What I know now, that I didn't know lying in that ICU bed with cedar and bergamot in the air and machines marking every heartbeat, the most dangerous assumption anyone made in this entire story was that being vulnerable meant being powerless. Owen assumed it. Philip assumed it. Serena, who had watched me at family dinners and concluded that I was soft where it mattered, assumed it most of all. They were wrong about the sedation. They were wrong about the power of attorney's scope. They were wrong about Linda. They were wrong about Adrienne. They were wrong, most of all, about me. There's something I've come to believe, in the time since, the people who underestimate you almost always do so for a reason that has nothing to do with you. They need you to be less than you are. It makes the math of what they're doing easier. It lets them sleep. Don't let them sleep easy. Know where your documents are. Know what you've signed. Digitize your family photographs. I lost 3 shoeboxes of irreplaceable pictures during the period Owen had access to the house, and that loss, absurdly small against the broader scale of everything else, still catches me sometimes when I'm not expecting it. Know who in your life is actually watching out for you, and tell them you see it. And if you are ever in a room, pretending to be something you are not, waiting for the right moment, be patient. The right moment always comes. There's something nobody tells you about betrayal at that scale. It doesn't arrive as a single moment. It arrives as a slow accumulation of small choices, his, mine, and the ones I didn't make because I wasn't paying close enough attention. Owen didn't become someone capable of forging my signature overnight. Philip didn't decide to build a shell company in Delaware on a random Tuesday. These things grew quietly in the space between what I assumed and what was actually true, and the uncomfortable part, the part I've had to sit with for a long time, is that I gave them room to grow. I trusted without verifying. I signed without reading. I saw the cracks and chose more than once to call them something else. That's not self-blame. I want to be clear about that distinction because I think it matters. What Philip and Owen did was entirely their own moral failure, and nothing I could have done or not done would have made it right. But intelligence, real intelligence, the kind that actually protects you, isn't just about being smart. It's about staying honest with yourself about what you're looking at. I stopped doing that somewhere around year 5 of my marriage, and I let comfort become a reason not to ask hard questions. What I learned from Linda is that integrity is a daily practice, not a personality trait. She had every professional reason to process those transfer documents and move on. Nobody would have questioned her. But she asked questions anyway, not because she was suspicious by nature, but because she had spent 15 years building a standard she refused to lower for anyone's convenience. That's what character actually looks like. Not dramatic moments of courage, but the small, unremarkable decision to do the careful thing when the easy thing is right there. What I learned from Adrienne is harder to put into words. She stayed in that room when she didn't have to. She documented when it would have been far simpler to forget. She did it with no guarantee that it would matter, no certainty that I would ever know, no reward waiting on the other side. She acted from the conviction that it was right, and that conviction alone was enough. There is a kind of quiet strength in that, available to anyone willing to pay the price of it, which is simply the willingness to be accountable to your own sense of what's decent even when no one is watching. And what I learned about myself, this one took longest, is that resilience isn't the absence of damage. I was damaged. I lay in a hospital bed listening to my brother talk about my future in past tense, and I was afraid in a way I have never been afraid before or since. But fear and powerlessness are not the same thing, and the distance between them is where every good decision I made in those months lived. I couldn't control what they had done. I could control how still I kept my face. I could control who I called the moment Owen stepped out for coffee. I could control how carefully I listened. Listen carefully. To the people around you, yes, but more than that, to the part of yourself that already knows when something doesn't add up. That part is not paranoia. That part is intelligence. Trust it.